Today's webcast is titled Measuring Outcomes and Implementation in a Field-Initiated Employment Project. We'll hear about the project titled Determining the Efficacy of the Self-Determined Career Development Model of Instruction to Improve Employment Outcomes for Adults with Developmental Disabilities. This project was funded from 2012 to 2015 and was highlighted in the 2015 NIDILRR Report to Congress, which documented the outcomes and impacts resulted from NIDILRR's investments. We'll hear about the project goals, measurement strategies, scale-up of the project resources, and the sustainable impacts it continues to have. Now it is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. George Gotto. He is the Interim Director at the University of Missouri, Kansas City Institute for Human Development. He works throughout the state of Missouri to conduct community-based research and training projects primarily targeted to health and wellness for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Dr. Gotto is the founding member of the Missouri Self-Determination Association, and he was the principal investigator of the project we'll hear about today. Dr. Gotto, thank you for taking time out to share about your project today. Are you ready to begin?
Yes, I am. Thank you, Anne, and thank you, everyone who is joining us. It was a nice surprise to be asked to talk about this project, as it's been over for a few years now, but it was one that we really learned a lot from. So I will just jump in. Anne already mentioned the title, but there it is. And it was funded by, at that time it was just NIDILRR, but NIDILRR now. And so here are the things that I'd like to talk about today. Just briefly, I'm going to talk a little bit about the model that we tested, the Self-Determined Career Development Model, and then I'll just talk about our overall project, including the objectives and how we structured the project, and a little bit about our participants. I'll also mention some of the I guess, better outcomes that we had, and also I think it's important to share with you some of the challenges we had with the overall project. And then lastly, I'll talk about some of the things that are ongoing related to the Self-Determined Career Development Model. So initially, the model was developed in the mid-90s by one of my colleagues and my mentor, actually, Michael Waymeyer, and some people that he was working with. And it was developed based off of what is called the Self-Determined Learning Model of Instruction. And that's a model that is used in schools to help youth with IDD learn to make decisions and begin to guide the direction of their lives, ultimately to help them become more self-determined. But what we realized, or what they realized, is that this sort of model didn't really exist for adults, at least not something that was specifically developed to promote self-determination. And so they tweaked the SDLMI and just a little bit, and made it into the Self-Determined Career Development Model. And the ultimate goal of that is to enhance the capacity of state and community vocational rehab services providers to enable persons with disabilities to get the careers and jobs that they want. So the key to making this work is the facilitator. So this is a facilitated model, and so usually the way it has worked is a facilitator will work with an individual on a one-on-one basis or with a very small group, and they'll provide support for working through the different aspects of the model, which I'll discuss in a little bit. And, they try to do so in a non-judgmental atmosphere where the efforts of the individuals are valued, and where they can act as an advocate for the success of the individuals they're working with. So as you might imagine, the level of support that the facilitator provides really varies from person to person, really depending on how much support they need. And then lastly, I'll just say that the facilitator can regulate problem-solving activities so that they can ensure that the actions and results that are taken by the individuals, that they address the wants and needs of the person. So with that, I'll just talk about this a little bit about self-directed learning. So this is really the sort of theoretical or base for the self-determined learning model of instruction, which then was transferred into the career development model. And it's really the foundation of both of those models. But for the SDCDM, what it means is that the person with the disability is able to set his or her own career and job-related goals, that they participate in decisions related to developing a plan of action to meet those goals, that they lead the implementation of their action plan, that they are able to evaluate their actions, and that they modify actions or goals to achieve their ultimate desired outcome. So the idea is that by participating in this and leading the efforts, with the help of the facilitator, that self-determined begins to emerge as they are active participants. If an adult has not had the opportunity to develop self-determination as they were, coming of age, when they were in school, then so the important thing about this slide is just the idea that we understand self-determination to refer to a characteristic of a person that leads them to make choices and decisions based on their own preferences and interests, monitor and regulate their own actions, and be goal-oriented and self-directing. And the thing that I just wanted to stress on this is that really what we're talking about is a psychological or personal characteristic of the individual. And the reason that's important for this particular model is because that means it's something that we can work on and develop, and which is exactly what we're trying to do with this model. So a key aspect of self-determination, as we have it defined here, is this concept of causal agency, which is about more than just being in charge of making choices and decisions, but it really is focusing on setting a goal and then making the changes that need to be made in order to reach that goal. And the intent is that, as the third bullet point says there, is that the individual is the one who is directing the process and is actively involved. By that, we're not saying that they do it by themselves. We're just saying that they are leading the process. Oftentimes, in fact, most times with this, in our experience, with a facilitator. So just a really important thing for facilitators to understand is that it's all about what the individual wants and the decisions that they make. So trying to help them make the best decisions possible. Because, as the last slide points out there, it's the interests and preferences of the individuals that really are driving the whole process. And so one of the things that we know from previous research is just that people who are self-determined are able to set employment and career goals based on their own abilities, interests, and preferences. We also know that people who are self-determined are able to solve problems that they encounter in work environments. They're better able to advocate for their own needs on the job, and they're able to identify the supports that they need in order to do the job. And those could be natural supports or provided by paid supports. And so being able to identify those ultimately helps them be more successful within the workplace. And so now I'd just like to talk a little bit about the actual model, the self-determined career development model. And it's broken down into 3 phases, each of which are listed here. And these are really the guiding questions for each phase. But first, what is my goal? What do I want to do? What is my plan to reach my goal? And then what have I learned about my ability to reach my goal, or what I need to do differently? So this next slide here shows a little bit more of the graphic representation of the model. And within each of the 3 phases, the participants, with the help of their facilitator, answer 4 questions, and so a total of 12 questions. And the idea is that, by going through each of these questions sequentially, they're beginning to learn, the process of setting a goal, taking actions to reach that goal, and then evaluating how well they did and adjusting their plan if they need to. And so I won't go through and read each of these. I'll just tell you a little story about a young man that worked to do this with us. And he was a person who had autism, and his passion, the thing he wanted to be more than anything, was a weather or a meteorologist. He loved weather patterns and learning about them. And so when we asked him that question in the first phase, what career and job do I want? He said, I want to be a meteorologist. And so the next question, what do I know about it? He knew a ton about, weather patterns and meteorology, but he really didn't know anything about what it took to become a meteorologist. And so he realized that in reference to the third question there, what must change for me to get a job and career I want, that he was going to need additional training. And so this is where we began to make our first goals. And I want to emphasize that one of the important things is that we set, not huge goals, but we set small, reachable goals and help the individuals work towards those goals. And then once they've achieved that, then they move to another small, reachable goal. And ultimately, then they're able to find out that, or to achieve the goal that they want. Anyway, one of the things that this guy decided he needed to do, or that he could do to begin to make the changes happen, is he was going to research schools where he could begin to learn about becoming a meteorologist. And so he started looking at colleges and universities in his area. And unfortunately, the way it turned out for him is that that he wasn't able to find a college that was closer than 3 hours away. The other thing is that he was going to contact some meteorologists in his area and begin talking with them about what they do and how he could go about becoming a meteorologist himself. And so those were the 2 actions that he was going to take in order to reach his employment goals. And one of the things, if you go to the second question in the second phase, what could keep me from taking action, he realized that he really did not like talking with people, or felt uncomfortable talking with people. And so he was really going to need to identify some supports that could help him begin to kind of get past the barrier of talking with people. So he had an older brother who was willing to help him. And so his brother ended up helping him make calls to meteorologists and went with him to meet with those folks. And then his brother also helped him to begin looking at what universities offered the things that he needed in order to become a meteorologist. And then what they did together is they set out a timeline. If you look at question number 4, when will I take action? And so And they set up a timeline for, we're going to call, a different person each day until we're completed, and we're going to, look into a different university each day in our area. So ultimately what happened is then they moved into, they did those things, and then they came back to the plan, and they identified what actions have I taken, and they really looked at the things they had done. They looked at the barriers that had been removed, and then they began to talk about what has changed to enable him to get the career or job that he wanted. And this, of course, happened over several months of time. But one of the things that changed for him is that he realized, he didn't want to go 3 hours away, which was where the nearest university was, to learn to be a meteorologist. He preferred to stay in his own community. And he also, what happened is when he was talking with the meteorologist, he learned about a weather club that existed in his community. And so he was invited to that, and there he began to meet other people who were every bit as interested in that topic as he was. And, they did a lot of things, like they worked with the National Weather Service to track storms when storms came through their area. And, so he got a radio so he could call in and report to the National Weather Service on his, the weather patterns in his area. And ultimately what he realized is that he didn't want to be a meteorologist, but he did really enjoy being a hobbyist related to, weather patterns. And as a part of this group, he was getting everything that he wanted out of that career. And then the neat thing that happened for him is that as being a part of that group, he met a person who had a small engine repair shop. And that gentleman, they became friends, and that gentleman ultimately offered this young man a job. And it ended up being a really great job for him. He had a friend that he was working for. He was really good at the work. And so then when we got to that question for, have I achieved what I want? The answer was, well, no, he did not achieve what he wanted in terms of being a meteorologist, but he did achieve a job and also finding a group of people who had similar interests. And then he began to go back to the beginning of the model and set new goals around his new job. So that was sort of a quick description of something that took about 9 months, but that's how it went with that particular young man. So now I'll just talk about our overall project. We really wanted to see what the outcomes were for using the SD-CDM. And so the first thing we needed to do is train our facilitators, and so we have a Train the Trainer series that it helps them go through what the self-determined career development model is and how they can lead the process. We also wanted to measure the impact on goals, on the goal setting process, and on achieving employment and career-related goals. We wanted to measure the impact that the model had on individual levels of autonomy and self-regulation. And then we wanted to be able to share this study with a wider audience of employment specialists and individuals with disabilities. So just quickly, we did a pre-test, post-test control group design, and what that means is we had a control group and a treatment group. The treatment group started immediately by implementing the model, and we've then collected data at pre and post times. We also collected data from the control group. They did not initially, they waited 6 months before they began to implement the model. So we collected data from them at the same time. And then after 6 months, they were able to begin using the model to set career goals. And this meant that everyone who participated got to engage with the model, but we also were able to have a control group that we could compare our results to. So some things that might also be important. Every facilitator, as I mentioned, received training, technical assistance, and coaching. And then people with disabilities who participated learned a flexible way to set and achieve goals. This is what I think I just wanted to mention, because this ended up being one of the areas where maybe we didn't succeed as much as we wanted to, but ultimately we recruited participants or participating sites. And so we worked with our Division of Developmental Disabilities in Missouri. We worked with our an Association of County Developmental Disability Services. We made presentations throughout the state to groups and organizations that were interested in employment of people with IDD. We sent either through letters or directly, by communicating with people. We talked to every job discovery service that was happening in Missouri and invited them to participate. And then in Missouri, we have things, organizations called Senate Bill 40 boards, or SB 40s, and they provide services at a county level. Many of them provide employment services, and so we also invited them to participate. So within each organization, we trained facilitators, and the facilitators were asked to do a number of things. First, they were asked to complete the city training, which is sort of a research ethics training. Second, they were asked to select people with IDD who they would help work on their career goals with. They were obtained consent, signed consent forms from each person or their guardian, and then before they did any of each activity, we asked them to get assent, just verbal assent that yes, I still would like to participate. So you can see the facilitators had a lot going on and a lot of work to do as a part of this research project. Normally, if they were just implementing it without having it be research, they wouldn't have had to do any of those things. This is just assent. It was really important to us that, especially for those people who had a guardian that signed on to them, that they were still given the power to agree or not to agree to participate in the project. And so before each activity, we asked that the facilitator go ahead and get assent. So these are just some of the reasons that we thought that a person with a disability would want to be participating. One is just to learn how to set goals and work towards those goals, and to learn more about themselves and develop self-determination in their lives. And then lastly, they were, at each time that we collected data, they received $20. So ultimately, when we finished the product, we touched many more people than the 198 people who had a cognitive disability, but we had high rates of attrition, which I'll talk about later. And so we lost probably over the course of the project, not quite half, but almost half of our initial participants. So of the 198, 110 were men and 88 were women, and that says ages ranged from 1 to 76. I should say 21 to 76. I don't know how I made that mistake. But and then lastly, one of the ways that we determined who could participate is by going through the scales with them. The people who weren't able to answer the ARC self-determination scale were excluded from the research, but they were not excluded from the, continuing to work with the model to set goals. It's just that we weren't able to use their answers or their information for the actual research portion of the study. We used two surveys. One is the ARC self-determination survey, and then the second was the autonomous functioning checklist. And each of these had very specific things that they were measuring. And then the third way that we measured progress was using goal attainment scaling. And that was a way that we were able to measure progress on their goals and measure it across all participants. Oops. So using those scales, we had some pretty good outcomes, and so I'll just talk briefly about some of those. And I will say that all these outcomes are outlined in an article that we wrote a couple years ago that was in the Journal of Vocational Rehabilitation, and that's cited here below. So the first was that we did learn that with the train-the-trainer model, that was successful in terms of training facilitators to implement the SDCDM with the participants, and that the greatest impact we saw was on the autonomy for the people, particularly the people who were in the treatment group. One thing that did happen is that there was growth happened, but it was very slow over time. And for us, that suggested that when you're using the model, considering long-term supports related to self-determination in the context of career development is really important. Particularly, and this was a really important finding, particularly for people who had a long history of other directedness in employment supports. So one of the things that we began to see is that people who were older, who had not had as much, opportunities to practice self-determined behavior, often needed more long-term supports, just because they had spent much of their adult life having other people tell them what they were going to do rather than making those changes themselves. And then a third outcome was that organization and facilitator factors had a huge impact on outcomes. So, this could be related to a variety of things, whether it's organizational culture or just the facilitator's enthusiasm and interest in using the model. As you can imagine, if they didn't have that level of enthusiasm, it wasn't successful. And if the organization wasn't fully behind the implementation of it, then again, it wouldn't be as successful. So this moves into outcome number 4, which is attending to environmental factors that influence consumers and staff within the organizations is critical in order to enable positive outcomes for all. And so really that's just, were the organizations really bought into the process, and did they really want to support it? And in some cases, actually, it wasn't even that they didn't want to support it, but maybe a facilitator was having to work with, 20-plus people, and it just becomes very difficult to set goals and work through the model with that many people. And so that's the kind of environmental factor we saw that had a direct impact on our outcomes. And then lastly, the study provides pretty good preliminary information that is being used currently to shape research, and it highlights the need to ensure the consideration of the community, the organization, and the support provider, in addition to the participant factors. If you don't have good, particularly organizational and facilitator or support provider factor buy-in to the process, it won't work as well. So we had some limitations, and so I'd just like to talk about some of those. And the biggest was this attrition. So we had originally were working with, I think, 32 organizations throughout the state who actually sent facilitators to our Train the Trainer program, and who initially were going to participate. By the end of the project, we only had 12 organizations that were still participating, and so one of the reasons why is that we weren't able to, for those organizations where it didn't work, to make the SDCDM model I guess, flow seamlessly with the supports they were already providing. And so that was a limitation for us. If it became extra work for the facilitators and the organizations, then we didn't have good success. And part of the problem was that our university required us to do the city training, which is the research ethics training, which is fairly intensive. It takes, several hours to complete. And ultimately, a lot of organizations said, we can't give up those several hours to complete this research ethics training. And so that was something that we did maybe wrong as researchers, is that we should have maybe come up with a better structure so that the facilitators weren't actually collecting data, because our internal review board was saying that we needed, because they were collecting data, they had to go through this research ethics training. So that was one thing that led to our attrition. The other was just a lot of the support providers, direct support providers, employment support providers we were working with, changed jobs. They just would leave, and so then we'd have to train a new facilitator. And so sometimes within an organization, we would have trained 3 or 4 different cohorts of facilitators, just because there was such within the organization. The support providers were leaving to go to another job. And then also, we just had some attrition of individuals who would either move or you just decide we did that ascent every time. Sometimes they would say, no, I'm tired of doing this, I don't want to do it anymore. And so then we would lose them for that reason. Resources at the organizational level, I sort of touched on that, but if they don't have the resources to hire enough direct employment support providers, then it made it really difficult to be successful, just because the individual support providers were providing supports to many people, and as I mentioned before, it just wasn't possible for them to really put the time into the model that is needed in order to see positive outcomes. And then, just the logistics of working with employment support providers. One of the things we learned is that, I mentioned the learning model of instruction. Within schools, it's really easy because everyone's contained within a classroom, and where you can always reach the teacher. They're always there, and the students they're working with are in the classroom with them. As you guys probably know, that's not always the case, and often is not the case with the employment support providers. They're often moving from site to site and from person to person, and so just the logistics of doing that, we had a real learning curve, and that ended up adding some time to our overall data collection. So just the nice thing about it is that a lot of this work, though, is continuing, and so here are just 4 different ways that it does continue, and below at the bottom of this slide, you'll see that there are some references to articles that have come out of some of the work that's going on. So it's been used with collaborative teams of stakeholders who impact employment in rural communities, and that's happening in Kansas. It's being used to impact knowledge of personal strengths, interests, and needs among adult job seekers with IDD. So this is a very specialized way of they're using the model, but all they're really focusing on is the impact it has on personal strengths, interests, and needs, and not so much on job outcomes. So that's another really interesting work that's happening. And then within Rhode Island, it's being used with students who are getting ready to transition into adulthood, so that they will have the related skills and begin to plan for that transition to work, identify what they want to do or what training they need. And that's happening throughout the whole state of Rhode Island, and it's a pretty neat process. And then lastly, we are just about done with the development of a web-based app that essentially it can be used by an individual and a facilitator to go through the whole model, and at the end, you'll have your whole plan available in PDF format that you can print out. And the neat thing about this is it includes video of a facilitator and an individual working through the model. So you can see, these are short videos, but you can see how people, other people are using it. So, so that's it, I guess, for me. Are there any questions?
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Gotto. It looks like we have a couple of questions, and I encourage others to chat their questions in. So Jennifer asks, how did you fund the development of the app? Let's go back to that slide. I'll do that.
Oh, a couple ways. We had our local Missouri Developmental Disability Council funded some of that. And then we also had a private donor who gave some money towards it. And I think that our Division of Developmental Disabilities was also interested in it, and they put some money towards it. So that's where we got that.
And will it be available to the public, or is it just within the state that it's being developed in?
No, it will be available to the public, and as soon as it's done, I guess I can send something to you, Ann, to let you know, and you could send it out to the network. It's really close. The issue that, in fact, it would be done, but the issue is that our web app developer found a better job and went off to do that. I guess a higher paying job, and so then we had to. Took us a while to find a replacement, but we now have that person's replacement, and he's started working on it in the last couple of weeks.
That's really exciting. I'm sure a lot of people on the line will enjoy seeing the app and seeing how to use it in those videos that are.
Yeah, it's really. I'm excited about it. It should be done by the end of the year, I think.
Excellent. And so for all of those who have registered today, I'll send that the link to the app whenever it is ready. Another question I have is, so it looks like your project has been sustainable for years after its completion. So were there strategies that you employed before your project ended to ensure that its future use, or are these sort of things that have just naturally evolved?
A little bit of both. So part of the thing is that this was a partnership both between my organization and an organization at the University of Kansas called the Beach Center on Disability. And the folks at the Beach Center, all of their work is focused on self-determination. And so there was just no doubt that they were going to continue to work on this and find partners. So they always have, they have a plan of all the different projects they want to continue or to begin, and they're always working on that. But there were some things that just happened, like I'm going to get some of the details wrong, but basically, for example, in the state of Rhode Island, it became really important to the state, for reasons that I don't fully know, that all employment support providers begin to have better outcomes for the individuals with IDD that they were working with. And so they contacted my colleagues over at KU and said, hey, we're not having good outcomes. Can you come help us? And that provided a really great opportunity, sort of without necessarily planning on it, to really continue the project. And then a couple of the other projects that I mentioned, those were grant funded, and so those were things that we knew we wanted to look at, and so we wrote grants specifically to support that work.
Excellent. it sounds like you've had a very successful project. Jennifer writes, again, Rhode Island is required to improve their outcomes under a settlement agreement with the U.S. Department of Justice. So that might be a little bit of background as to why the state reached out to your project. So it's great that you guys were able to fulfill that need. So it looks like those are all the questions we've had. And I wanted to thank you, Dr. Gotto, for stepping in and presenting this information to our project and to our audience. And I wanted to thank everyone else who is on the phone and who was able to join us today as well. Before we close, I'd like to invite everyone to fill out a brief evaluation form. I'll post it in the chat box right now. And I'll also email it to everyone who has registered. In this evaluation, you can ask about any questions that you might think about after this webinar is over, and it'll help us inform our future activities as well. And finally, before we close, I want to just say we appreciate the support of NIDILRR to carry out today's webinar and of your time, Dr. Gotto. So thank you very much. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you all. I appreciate it.